Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 180, and I am the show's host, Kyle. On this episode of the show, I'm going to be discussing the situation in Syria. Of course, we have heightened tensions between the United States and the Assad government, which also means Russia and Iran. And so I'm going to catch everybody up on what's been happening over the past couple days there. I also want to touch on the Pompeo hearing and Skripal poisoning. So these are important stories, and if you want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. Okay, so let's update the situation in Syria. Of course, you have the neighborhood of Douma, which is controlled by the Saudi-backed Army of Islam, and that was besieged and surrounded by the Assad government. Some of these rebels had started to surrender to the Assad government. However, those surrenders stopped, and then the rebel group Army of Islam within Douma actually launched a couple mortars and grenades over the lines and killed some civilians outside of Damascus, which of course is the capital of Syria. And then on April 7th, you have the alleged chemical weapons strike on what some people say a hospital, other people looks more like a house to me from the videos and images shown. And in that attack, somewhere between 40 and 80 people died. Now, if you want, listen to what I think about the actual attack, again, check out the last show with Will Porter. We discussed this. But basically, there's a lot of reasons to believe it's possible that this wasn't a chemical weapons attack, a traditional weapons attack that possibly caused the building to collapse and then the suffocation of 80 people. Of course, there's a possibility that was a complete false flag, or it's a possibility that no attack happened at all and this was staged. Of course, there are the allegations that Assad did carry out the attack, but there's no evidence really to suggest that's what happened. So what we've had going on the past couple of days is the United States looking to respond to Trump, or to Russia, or Assad, I guess, over this attack. Now, this is extremely complicated by the fact that Russia backs Assad, and there's a large Russian military presence in Syria, and they are helping Assad to fight against the Syrian resistance to Assad, and this includes both Al-Qaeda or Al-Nusra, which has now changed their name, I believe, to HTS. They're still Harar al-Sham in Syria. But there's also various other rebel groups that have various amount of allegiances to Osama bin Laden or Zawahiri, and still some ISIS factions loyal to Baghdadi in Syria that the Syrian and Russian government is fighting against. And then you also have rebel groups that are maybe a little bit less about the global jihad, but are definitely very extreme Sunni Muslims or radicals that pick up rifles, they cut off heads, they carry out suicide attacks. They buy into that very extreme Wahhabist ideology and are dangerous people. So any strike that the United States carries out in Syria, one, risks provoking a confrontation with Russia, either because Russia needs to show the rest of its allies that it will defend them. Countries like Belarus in Eastern Europe really put themselves in harm's way by, siding with Russia in this split between NATO and Russia, and many of the neighboring states have now become NATO allies. And so if Russia wants to maintain its alliances around the world, whether it be with Belarus, Syria, or their, somewhat shaky relationship with Iran, or the relationship they're trying to develop with Syria, it's pretty common, and I don't know how true it is all the time, but it's pretty common that countries feel like they need to defend their allies to show their other allies they'll also step up and defend them should they come under attack. Like I said, I don't know how much I believe it, but the U.S. certainly makes this assessment as well and is constantly saying that we need to defend our allies to show that America stands with its friends or whatever. Maybe a little bit more of a Republican talking point than a Democratic one, but generally people in America seem to believe that. There's also the possibility that attack against Assad, if it was violent enough against Assad, could provoke a Russia response because they would feel that an attack that was very destabilizing against Assad would risk reversing the progress that they have made in very bloody progress against the Syrian resistance, like I said, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And it could allow those groups to take power and come to force again. And again, I probably buy this argument a little bit less, and it's probably a little bit true than, the Russians or the Americans may make it out to believe. This is certainly an assessment that the Americans made too. Remember, it was just over a week ago when Trump was threatening to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, not threatening to bomb Assad in Syria, that we were hearing a U.S. withdrawal would mean the rise of ISIS. And so similarly, that should be true if Assad were to fall or for his forces to be, damaged or depleted. This would be a boon for those groups. And then, there's just a risk of direct confrontation with Russia if you bomb Syria. There's plenty of Russian military personnel and equipment there. A lot of Syria's, and I'm sure the missile defense systems that they would use would be the Russian ones. And so this could put the United States in a position where they, like the Americans would they be in the Americans' place, would feel that they need to retaliate against the Americans because their military was damaged, injured, destroyed, killed by the Americans. And so this is, a serious thing to happen. And so that's, the position that we're in today. I just want to stress how dangerous it is and how quickly any strike against Assad and Syria could lead to an American response. Now, what the American response seems to be is that at least it seems that Trump is threatening to form a coalition. It looks like both the UK and France have bought in, as well as Saudi Arabia. We have the British moving ships into the region, the United States moving ships into the region, and I'm going to get into a little bit more of the ship movements later. The other interesting note here, a member of the coalition would be Qatar. Now, Qatar sits in a very interesting, a very dangerous position, I would think, in Syria. In the past, the Qataris have backed the Syrian resistance to Assad, including factions loyal to jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, ISIS. And so this would put them at odds with Russia, Iran, and Assad. However, I believe it was May, but it may have been June of 2017. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainians all cut ties with Qatar, blockaded the country, and tried to force that country to succumb to their will, claiming that country was a backer of ISIS. But really, they had a lot of problems with Qatar because the Qataris were a lot closer to Iran than the rest of the Middle East. And they were urging that peace talks were possible and that the Arabians could learn how to get along with the Persians, was essentially, their argument, the point they were making. As I said, that didn't sit well with the Saudis and the rest, or most of the rest of the GCC, and they cut Qatar off. The Qataris didn't cave. They actually received support from Turkey, Iran, and Oman, and have been able to outlast and withstand this split in the GCC. Now, the Qataris share, I think, the world's biggest natural gas field with the Iranians, since it's in both of those countries' land area or water right area, as it lies under the Persian Gulf. I think how it works is they make agreements that, each country will only pump 400,000 barrels or whatever measurement of the gas a day. And so, there's a very careful and very important balance that goes on between these countries because both countries are pretty reliant on that natural gas field in order to fund, all the things that the governments in those countries do. Now, another interesting position Qatar plays in the Middle East is a home to American Central Command, housing 10,000 American troops. And we have a huge air base there, and it's a big deal. And this is a very important staging area for what the Americans do in the Middle East. And so that really put Qatar in interesting crossroads, like I said, in 2017, when they are cut off from the rest of the GCC in Syria, because suddenly the people that they're relying on in the Iranians are on the opposite side of them in that war. And, the reliance really increased as Qatar needed Saudi or Iran to get imports from, because if you look at Qatar on a map, it's just a tiny little peninsula off of Saudi Arabia. And so if it wasn't for the Iranians, the Qataris could be in real trouble. Now, there's also a Turkish base in Qatar, and Turkey has remained allies and supportive of Qatar throughout the split. For the first, 10 months or so of this split, it seemed that the Americans were more or less taking the side of the Qataris. It really only seemed that Rex Tillerson was concerned about trying to find a solution here in the Trump administration. There's a lot of speculation and reporting on what role Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, had in possibly greenlighting the split between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, or I guess pushing Donald Trump, his father-in-law, to take a certain position. There's reports that just before the blockade started, the Qataris had turned down the Kushners for a big loan they were seeking for their property, I believe, sits Fifth Avenue in New York City. And so, like, as you could already see here, and I'm sure some of you who aren't, quite up on foreign policy as others are probably like, well, what the hell is actually going on here? And you should feel that way, I guess is an important thing to say. That the situation that these countries and that the United States is finding themselves in geopolitically makes absolutely no sense. Where the country where we stationed Central Command and 10,000 troops is loyal to the country that we're about to bomb the allies of in Syria and possibly their troops. And so it's a really dangerous and tedious situation. It does look now, though, like Trump has taken the side of the Qataris and has agreed to sell them $300 million in weapons. And I'm not sure, they're upgrades to weapons to make them, I guess, more long-range bombs or something like that, more effective weapons. But it's not, I mean, by Middle Eastern Gulf state standards, this isn't a massive arms sale. Usually we're talking about billions. This is only $300 million. And so it may be more of a ceremonial thing. But then Trump also told Saudi Arabia to end the GCC dispute. And I think actually the word I saw used was demanded, not asked, not said, demanded that Saudi Arabia end that dispute. So we'll see what happens in the coming days. Obviously, if the United States is looking to stage an attack against Russia in the Middle East, it kind of needs all of its Arab allied partners to fall in line and not be bickering amongst themselves. Because if the Qatar issue with Saudi Arabia is more important to them than the United States issue with Assad, Russia, and Iran, then, our troops stationed there are, one, becoming a very difficult and maybe even a liability position. But in general terms, you just, run the risk of having something catastrophic go wrong or an alliance fall apart or your allies start fighting against each other and give up the fight you want them to fight. And just how shows how impossible what the United States is trying to do in Syria is. And this is just one small aspect, one little snapshot of what's going on geopolitically right now in Syria. There's also this story I saw that a lot of people seem to be interested in, that Russia's jamming U.S. drones in Syria. Now, I can't find out, or at least I haven't found out a lot of information on this, and this isn't something that I'm super comfortable with Googling, to be quite honest to all of you. How drones receive their signals from wherever CIA hub it is. But it does seem to me that this technology has been employed in the past, and so we don't have like a precedence or something, or a lack of precedence that the United States would interpret this as an act of war, and they don't seem to be doing it thus far. It also doesn't seem to me to be like a curtain type of thing, where Russia is completely preventing any U.S. drones from operating in Syria. It's like a little bit more targeted, I guess, like they actually have to try to disrupt the signal to a specific drone. And as I believe just said, this was used in Ukraine about 4 years ago. At the UN, there's been a couple of proposals to investigate the attack. The one the Americans proposed, either the Russians vetoed or it never came to the floor because the Russians said they opposed it. And then the Swedes made a proposal for inspectors to go in, and this was backed by the Russians, and the Americans vetoed it. And so I always find it very interesting, and this is something that I've pointed out, and I think is kind of important about the UN, is that the US is always demanding that we have these lopsided proposals or things happen by the UN Security Council, and then Russia vetoes it. So the US says, we want to hold Assad accountable for chemical weapons attack. And the Russians say, well, absolutely not, because what you're doing is just condemning Assad without proof. And we don't think Assad carried out this chemical weapons attack. And then you have the American media and the Western media saying, oh my God, the Russians are preventing somebody from being held accountable in Syria over a chemical weapons attack. It's like, well, that's really not what's going on, and your side of this whole thing really isn't being honest about the whole thing either. But, the United States doesn't get that criticism in the mainstream media. Rachel Maddow didn't go on TV last night and say, oh my God, Nikki Haley violated the ethical, moral code of how people are supposed to act in the world by not voting for this specific UN resolution that condemns or would have investigated the weapons attack in Syria. And maybe I should have used Maddow because I actually didn't watch a show last night, but this kind of goes against what she always says about Russia and how she demonizes Russia. But we do have Russia going to allow the OPCW, which is the international watchdog on chemical weapons And this group obviously has its problems, and I've discussed about them on past episodes of the show. But Russia is going to allow them in, and I would guess that's happening about now. The end of the week started time, so hopefully Friday, Saturday, we see these investigators come in and make some kind of findings before the U.S. carries out an attack. We also have the Assad army claiming that they have liberated Douma and that all the rebels who are going to fight have left that area in the evacuations agreed to by the Syrian army. I think most of these times, these fighters are only allowed to carry small weapons, so I'm guessing like an AK-47 and a pistol with them as they take the bus to the Idlib province, and they had to leave their substantial amount of cash and bigger weapons behind. Now, Thursday morning, there was a tweet, and for the first time, this was something that I think a lot of us were able to read and breathe a sigh of relief on this Syria situation. Because Trump said, I never said we were going to attack the Russians in the first place. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. And this is really, to me, it seems to be the first time that anybody in the Trump administration and possibly in the mainstream U.S. establishment said, maybe we don't have to do anything here. And so it's really good to see this out of Trump. I'm not quite sure why. I'm going to talk about the two things I have speculated. And that is one, Mattis presented options to Trump on April 11th, so that would be Wednesday. And so maybe there are no good options. Maybe Trump looked at the folder and said, okay, so I could carry out a very limited attack against Assad, and Russia would, make a big deal out of that, and maybe they would bomb a single Kurdish target or something like that, but their response would be minimal and limited, and we could pretend like we did something and move on. Or we could attack Assad in a way that's going to provoke a Russian attack. Those are kind of the two options. And both of those options seem absolutely terrible and stupid to pursue. And maybe, Donald Trump not being the, establishment kind of thinker, he doesn't seem to go along with all of his faults. And sometimes this ends up very bad for the American people. That there's like this consensus that the United States must do something. And, him being able to butt the consensus, maybe this is something, positive that we're seeing here. So that happened. Looked to be not the worst thing, but again, I don't think that we're completely out of the woods on a possible U.S. attack against Assad in Syria. The other thing worth noting is I believe I saw the story on the morning of the 12th, and that was Mattis said that the United States was still looking at the intelligence on the chemical weapons attack, and they don't seem to have drawn a firm conclusion. And so it was amazing to me that everybody gets away with saying Assad did it, Assad did it, Assad did it, or strongly applying that Assad did it. I mean, some of these political figures do a little bit of a better job of saying that, well, it looks like, Assad did it to me. We think Assad did it. Our intelligence is saying that Assad did it, but never actually, just blatantly saying that, yes, Assad was guilty of carrying out a chemical weapons attack in Douma, Syria, April 7th, 2018. And the media could be slippery like that too, but I've seen a lot of people in the media just come out and say that Assad obviously did it, and if you don't believe it, you're wrong. In fact, I was listening to a clip of Mark Levin, and he was just saying, what do you mean Assad did it? My sources in the Israeli intelligence are telling me that they did. And, the guy is just a complete kook and a loon on the whole situation, has absolutely no proof, but man, is he sure that Assad did it. All right, last thing I want to talk about on the Douma situation before, I spend another 25 minutes on it, and that is, there was an interview Around the Empire podcast. Joanne Leon hosted it. The guest was Daniel L. Davis, who did amazing work on Afghanistan. There's a big section in the Fool's Errand by Scott Horton that focuses on the work that Daniel Davis did, explaining why the war there, I guess, maybe not why, but that the war there has been a failure. But on this episode, he discusses Syria, and he talks specifically about the U.S. troops in Syria, saying that 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria could never occupy or, control the country in any significant way. Just look now, however, the U.S. fighters in those areas, and this is going to sound terrible to say, but it's just the blatant reality of the situation, make good targets for the Russians, the Iranians, the Assad government, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS, should they choose to want to carry out an attack on America. And this may sound like a very radical thing to say, but remember, this was Osama bin Laden's plan. He knew that he did not and could never get enough crazy jihadist, radical Wahhabi Sunni nut jobs to go to America and fight a war against the Americans and overthrow the American empire. Wasn't ever going to happen. He did watch what the Americans did in Afghanistan in the 1980s by backing the Mujahideen, drawing the Russians in, and then letting that bankrupt the empire in Iran. And boy, did he do the same exact thing to the Americans, because once the Americans came to the Middle East, then you could just attack the American troops in the Middle East, and then the Americans will never leave because they say, you keep killing our troops, so we gotta kill you. And it's just created this perpetual cycle now that's gonna last forever until the Americans are bankrupt. Because really I don't know what the other option would be short of genocide of most of the Middle East. Another interesting story from Syria we're talking about is that we have Mike Pompeo testifying at his congressional hearing today to become the Secretary of State of the United States of America. And to me, this is absolutely a terrifying notion. And what I plan to do is kind of pit through the confirmation hearing, try to find some good clips and bring it to you and break it all down on Monday's show. But there's just a couple of things that I want to touch on from that hearing today. One is that he confirmed that a couple hundred Russians were killed in that attack that happened somewhere along the Euphrates River Valley in Syria. Pompeo said a handful of weeks ago, I should have looked up the date before I came on. But anyways, this, I guess, has been more or less disputed. The accounts I read said 4 to 5 Russians. Now, this is 200 or 300, and he is the director of the CIA, so I guess he would be the one to know such a thing if that was actually the case. Now, if that is the case, we should take a couple takeaways from that. One, the Russian government didn't do anything to respond to this. And so it should show us and be an example to us that Vladimir Putin isn't the unhinged, unrestrained, dangerous madman that everybody in the United States pretends that he is. And he's very calculated and understood the situation, and that he really couldn't defend what had happened there. And so rather than make a big public deal out of it, decided to just downplay the situation. I find it odd, too, that this is in the lead up to the election of Vladimir Putin. And while, he had the elections occur, I mean, this could have been a real thing that his opponents could have capitalized on. I'm not sure if they tried to, I don't live in Russia or read Russian media, but they could have really said that, hey, Vladimir Putin pretends like that he's going to stand up for the Americans, but a couple hundred Russians just got killed in Syria, and he hasn't said a damn word about it. In fact, he said, well, Russians fighting in Syria, not for the Russian government, do so more or less at their own risk. And so, imagine if you got a couple hundred Russian soldiers, that means you have a couple hundred parents, you have 100 or so wives, you have some children, and you could really rally and put all these people together and say, Putin is doing absolutely nothing about our loved ones, and apparently cares more about the Syrians and President Bashar al-Assad in Syria, that he's willing to placate the Americans and not respond to their blatant, aggressive attack against Russia, and instead is doing nothing about it, so the Americans don't go after Assad or something like that. That's the case they could have easily made, and point they could have easily made, and it had to be a real, kind of political danger calculation for Putin, but, again, just goes to show that, maybe he isn't the reckless madman that people say he is. One of the disturbing things about this statement is that Pompeo uses it as an example to say that the Russians met their match in Syria. Now, remind you that this wasn't the Russian military, that this was a Russian mercenary force that was allied or employed by Iran, Hezbollah, or Assad. And they were apparently on a search and destroy mission for ISIS, but I'm not sure how true that is. But either way, this wasn't the Russian military. But Mike Pompeo takes this as a sign is that the Americans could bully the Russians and the Russians won't do a damn thing about it. And we know that that's, not going to be the case if America starts taking shots at the Russian military. One of the reasons that Vladimir Putin just rolled out and showed the world his new nuclear weapons capabilities, was to show that Russia was not America's punching bag. And so it's disturbing to me that either Mike Pompeo doesn't understand the threat of Russian deterrence and the fact that Russia, would assume at some point will be willing to defend itself and its allies. And I guess the fact that Mike Pompeo evaluates the situation that American force is so overwhelming that the Russians wouldn't even try. And so if you have this understanding and you're looking at the situation in Syria and saying what should happen to Assad, and you say, we're going to wipe out Assad's entire air force, and Russia knows that in any fight they would get absolutely lit by the Americans, and so they're not going to respond and they're just going to take it. This is the danger, right? This is this is why we're afraid of having Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State. Another disturbing point is where Mike Pompeo seems to disagree with Trump, saying that Russia participated in the 2016 election in America. I guess, he didn't quite, say that Hillary Clinton would have won had Russia not participated. But he said that Russian bad behavior is to blame for the conflict between Russia and America, and not as Trump recently applied the Mueller investigation in the Russian probe and the whole Russiagate scandal and scenario. And I think Trump's narrative there is a little bit closer to the truth. I mean, there's the general war hawkishness, and you remember McCain wanted to go to war with them back in 08, way back when then. And, John Bolton in 2002 was busy hurrying the Americans out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And so I guess, to chalk it all up to Russiagate wouldn't necessarily be fair, especially since the Republican Party has long been the hawks and those pushing the idea that Russia was a threat to the United States. However, that is much closer to the truth than the one-sided and absolutely lacking of any real detail or full story, complete half-truths that Mike Pompeo puts out, that the Russians invaded Crimea and Syria and are looking to dominate the entire world again. And this is why we must take them out. Pompeo also said that Trump could carry out a strike on Syria without congressional approval. He brought up the safe haven myth in Afghanistan, saying that that's the reason why Americans need to stay. I guess got into a little bit of a back and forth with Rand Paul on that one, and I want to dig a little bit more into that over the weekend and get more into that. But most of you who listen to this show have heard me debunk the safe haven myth in the past about Afghanistan, and know that it's absolute bunk to say that, we have to stay in Afghanistan because, we just have to kill all the right jihadists and then we can finally leave. One positive thing I did see is that he said that the goal in Syria is to have fewer Americans on the ground. The OPCW put out a report on the Sergei Skripal poisoning, claiming that the evidence they saw showed that some kind of toxic agent was used in the attack. Now, I have seen this reported that the OPCW confirmed that Russia carried out the attack, and this doesn't seem to be the case, at least in the press release that they announced to the public. It just confirms that some kind of chemical agent was used. That's all. I didn't even see, and unless maybe I misread it or something like that, that they even said it was one of the Novichok chemical agents that everybody is claiming must be developed in Russia and be, from Russia. There's an awful lot of weird stuff going on with the daughter of Sergei Skripal, Yulia Skripal, and that it seemed that there was a conversation between her and her cousin that was released, and now she's saying that she doesn't want to be contacted by her family or Russia, while she was a Russia who had, just been on a visit to the UK, and so I think there's a lot of details there yet to be surfaced. However, it's just important for y'all to know that if somebody tells you, oh yeah, no, the international group said Russia did it, that's definitely not what happened. Last thing, and I'll make this quick. On Friday, so today, the day the podcast is airing, there's planned protests in Gaza. This would be the third week of the sits that they're doing the march. The previous 2 weeks have resulted in Israeli snipers shooting hundreds of people in the ankles and killing over 30 now in total. And so it's been an absolute bloodbath in the past. There's a huge lack of evidence to show that the Palestinians are doing anything other than burning tires and throwing rocks at tanks. There's reports of firebombs and Molotov cocktails being thrown. The evidence that I've seen that this is happening is pretty limited. They are using burning tires, but that's to obscure the sight of the Israeli snipers as to be able to protest without being shot. And then to update the Ahed Tamimi story, her family was able to, receive 2 hours of the tens of hours that this poor 16-year-old girl at the time, child, was interrogated by the Israeli military police. That video shows threats to Ahed's family and friends if she does not sign a confession. And the family is also claiming that Ahed was subject to sleep deprivation up to 34 hours and was also the victim of sexual harassment sexual abuse by the Israeli soldiers. This included seemed to be, in the video, one man moving very close to her in a way that I know, if you were a 16-year-old girl captive in a room full of hostile people would have definitely seemed like a very scary thing that he was doing. And you can't tell by the video, but maybe he actually put his hands on her. Anyways, that's where I'll wrap up the show for today. It's been a crazy week at Foreign Policy Focus. I know, when we got on Monday's show, it looked like the United States and Trump was really implying that there was going to be some kind of military response to the alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma. I guess the improvement between Monday and Friday is that the attack hasn't happened, and it now seems that Trump has at least suggested that an attack may not happen for the first time. And so we may, this may be okay. We'll see how things go over the weekend. I'll be back on the show Monday. I'm sure I'll be updating Douma, the protests that are going to happen in Gaza over the weekend, and several other stories. But I hope you all are enjoying the show. I've gotten some good feedback on the show from the past couple of days. A huge thanks to Will Porter, who comes on the show so often to share his insight and knowledge. I was also just on the Peace and Liberty podcast again, hosted by Stephen Clyde. Great show host. I really enjoy it. So if you want to go check that out, it's linked on the YouTube page Immersion News. I have 3 playlists there. One just every foreign policy focus episode. One is the interview specifically with Will Porter. And then the third is my interviews that I do on other shows. I may try to get a collection of Will's other interviews on there as well, just because Will does so much work with me in Immersion News and everything. All right. So anyways, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com if you want to share the show, libertarianinstitute.org. Give me a rating on iTunes or Stitcher. If you want to help the show, to get some better equipment, other stuff, you go to my Patreon page /foreignpolicyfocus. I'm on Minds and MeWe now, 2 next generation social media sites that are far superior to Facebook. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE, YouTube and BitChute. The name is Immersion News. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy all the content.